Hello and welcome to the next episode of Soviet School of Chess. We are still talking about general tactics and strategy in the topic of restriction of mobility, but now in particular we'll talk about how the piece is restricted when it performs a defensive role. So the mobility of a piece is limited when it's occupied with the defense of the another piece or some other important point. And in many such cases, the diversion or capture of the defender proves decisive in the game. So in other words, once a piece has the role of defending other piece, it restricts its mobility because it cannot move freely on the board, for it has to defend another piece. So let me show you a few examples and you'll see what is this all about. This is the first position. If you just briefly analyze it, you will see that the mobility of the bishop on f8 is limited by the defensive role, and this bishop has a role to defend g7 square, because if g7 square is not defended, then this pawn can promote. So this is the example of restricted mobility by the defensive role. So this bishop has to defend this square, and the bishop cannot wander around. So the winning move here is bishop to e7, and now the game is lost, because if bishop takes, then the pawn will just promote. If the bishop doesn't take, then white will just take the bishop. So white wins in this position. So this is in tactical books, it's usually called removing the defender pattern. And you can see the typical pattern here in the next position. So for example, here you can see that this bishop is restricted by defending the rook, which is under attack by a king. So if this bishop ever moves or is removed from the board, then this rook will fall. So the correct move here, in order for white to draw, is to take the bishop. And now if the king takes the rook, then there is no longer a defender of the rook, and white can take the rook as well, and it's a draw. Okay, let's go to the next example. So in this position, you can see that this rook on c1 is a defensive piece. So this rook on c1 is defending the queen on c3. And so if this queen was to be attacked, then the mobility of this rook will be restricted by the fact that it is a defensive piece. So if you think this way about the position, then you can come up with the combination, and the correct move here for black begins with bishop takes c4, and now once the queen takes the bishop, now you have this situation. So the queen is attacking the queen, and this rook is thus limited, his mobility is limited by being the defensive piece. So the next winning move is rook d1 check. And now you can see that white can resign here, because if white takes the rook, then the queen will fall. So this rook cannot move because its mobility is restricted by the defending of the queen, like we said already. Or if white tries something else, if he tries just to escape the check, then another motive here is that this rook is not only limited by the defensive role of the queen, but it's also pinned. So if white will do something like this, then you can first take the queen, and after the rook takes, then this rook is hanging. So, there are several different ways of looking at this position. Okay, so you have to see this first move. So from this position, you can see that this rook is limited by defending the queen, but also by defending another rook, in a way. So this is one of the very good examples of what does it mean to limit the piece by giving it a defensive role. Okay, next example. Now here the piece which is limited by being a defensive piece is a queen. So queen is defending the rook. If the queen would move around, then this rook would fall, and it will fall also with a check. So this is the piece with limited mobility. So let's do how to exploit it. So if this queen has limited mobility, then we should think about how to attack the queen. And the attacking move and the winning move is queen to c6, attacking the queen. And now this works because once this rook is taken, it will be with check. So if white just takes the queen, then you take the rook with the check. King has to move away, and now you take the queen, and you are up a rook. So let's see what other possibilities are there instead of taking the queen. So here white doesn't have to take the queen, but whatever he does, he will be lost. So for example, he can just retreat the queen, and still keeping defense of the rook. But now you have to notice that, well, for this combination to work, also this rook is undefended. So now this queen has a double defensive role. The queen has to defend both rooks, and the queen cannot defend both rooks. So after black takes the rook, queen takes the rook, it has to, because king cannot even move here, then black takes another rook, and this is it. Or, for instance, white could try something like queen to d3, again, moving the queen by defending the rook, but the same motif, both rooks are undefended, so the queen is now protecting both rooks, so again, just rook d1 check, and after queen takes the rook, you take this rook. So the fact here in this position is that, this undefended piece is a very important aspect of the position, but nevertheless, every tactical sequence depends on this queen being a defensive piece and thus restricted in mobility. Okay, let's go to the next example. Again, we are looking for the piece which has a defensive role and thus restricted in mobility, and the piece is this rook. So this rook is defending this rook which is under attack. So the rook on f8 has a defensive role and limited mobility, and white exploited it by playing knight takes f7. And now, how to take this knight back? If, for example, king takes knight, then queen e6 is a checkmate. So this is out of the question. And if rook takes knight, well, then this rook is hanging because no longer has a defender, so he's down a rook. So actually, in this game, and this was a game between Keres and Fine in the Chess Olympiad in Moscow 1946, Fine actually managed to find the only move which doesn't lose on the spot, and this is queen to d7, and now game goes on, but black is down a pawn, and eventually Keres as white would win this game. Okay, and another and final example. Again, we are looking this from the black perspective, so it's black's turn to move, and let's see which piece has a defensive role. And if you look closely, then this queen is defending two very important pawns. So both pawns are attacked, and both pawns are defended by the queen. So this gives you an idea that you want to attack this queen, to move this queen away, and then you can seize opportunity of these weak squares, weak pawns. So the correct and winning move here is e5. So after e5, white queen has to move, and one of these pawns will fall. So this is not a move which wins right away. It doesn't win on the spot, but it will result in losing the pawn, one of these two pawns. The pawn will be lost with a check. So it's both losing the pawn and giving the initiative to black. And this game was eventually decided in the end game, and black won because he had a significant advantage. Okay, and this concludes today's lesson. So we talked about restriction of mobility by a piece being a defensive piece. So try to avoid having pieces which are purely defensive, which permanently perform defensive role, and also try to spot when your opponent has a piece which has a defensive role, because this is the source of many tactical combinations and winning variations. I hope you liked the lesson, and if you did, stay tuned, new lessons are coming, and so see you very soon. Cheers.